is that I'm always nervous in the presence of so many lawyers. Between bankers and lawyers, I don't know which is worse, but I get nervous around lawyers. Bankers are the worst, right? That's what they say about lawyers. But you know, I think maybe to respond to your question, Nikhil, right at the beginning of our democracy, the dawn of our democracy, we identified at least three fault lines, which leads to poverty, inequality, and race, and how all three continue to just become this heavy burden on South African society. It's a reality that we have to live with, and I think we have to deal with. Sorry, instead of live with. So we have to deal with. And I think race is or racism is a lived reality, and I'm always worried when South Africans react to incidents. So there's one incident, and all of us go mad, and the whole country is about to burn down. And then 2 days later, we forget about that incident. We wait, and we wait for another big incident. If it makes it to social media again, there's an uproar. And that one will take a week long or maybe two, and then we wait again. It's as if we play a waiting game instead of dealing with racism, because it's a lived reality for many black people. And I found the question that's asked in the concept note, whether our honeymoon is over. And I asked myself, did we ever enjoy a honeymoon? Because for me, racism became a reality ever since they were born. It continues to be a reality. And sometimes they don't, you then assimilate and you accept it, therefore it's no longer serious racism. I get horrified by people who tell me, no, rural areas, there's no racism because we live peacefully together. But you just have to observe how people live in that living together, how the living together is defined. It's still on the basis of you being the inferior and me being the superior, and race being the definer of that relationship. And I think it's important that we not only always just deal with the incidents, and I think until such time that we stop addressing racism on an incident basis, then we will get somewhere. Thomas Piketty, we hosted Thomas Piketty in 2015, last year in fact. We noted that with our poverty, yes, we are one of the worst in terms of inequality, but that you cannot divorce our levels of inequality from race. In the minute we do that, where we start saying, no, but there are black people who are rich, and you then don't deal with the issue of poverty and race, that link that's there. Now, I want to refer back to what Ndu said in terms of this being an institution of learning. I will come to your question. So Ndu's question about this being a university where you should actually enjoy everything that comes to the university. I always say that having a degree when you're black is not enough. It's a fact. Having a degree when you're black is not enough anymore. You must have something in addition to a degree, which are connections that break into particularly the state, because government becomes the greatest employer of black people who are qualified. But then in the private sector, you make it just, and if you do, you are one of the few. And so, until such time that this exceptionalist thing for black people changes, we're going nowhere in terms of racism. Because there's the exception. You find Nikhil who becomes the exception, and he breaks it into that system, and he becomes that different black. And that is also not right. Now, we had this is my last point, we had a dialogue, close dialogue with Agri SA recently, And it was interesting how the Land Claims Commission released a report, I think in 2012, 2013, about the number of, in terms of hectares, land claims that were successful for black farmers, who then got the land, just worked on the land maybe for 2 years, at most 3, and then they sold it back to the white farmer who had the area. There's something in the system that's wrong. So before we even get to the thing of property rights, let's also sort that out. Because it says that there is something wrong in how public-private partnership doesn't work in sorting out land claims and making sure that that land becomes productive, continues to be used, and that people are not quick to then just grab the money and go to the city. Now, did Madiba sell out? I always say that when this became a big thing last December, after some speech in England, we then were asked, did Madiba sell out? I said, we've never been in the business of defending Madiba. I'm not about to do it here today. So Madiba's legacy stands on its own, and I think, if anything, he tried to put systems in place to ensure that with, not him alone obviously, but the system that was put in place was to included things like having to find people who went missing, never been traced, having to deal with special pensions, issues of healthcare, access to healthcare for those who are identified as victims. The Truth Commission's recommendations around the way we deal with memory, for example. Some of these things have been forgotten. And it's as if that history was parked somewhere. And now we remember where we are today. So whenever I speak to young people at the foundation, they say, no, don't tell me about it. Where we are today, that context is important because it means we failed that generation of leadership. Some of the things that they recommended that they knew would work today, we didn't take forward. And I think if there is a sellout, it's us who continue to fail that legacy today in terms of saying, what is that we're gifted with that we didn't take forward? What is it that we needed to dump once we realized 20 years later, 15 years later, that it didn't work? But we only make it an excuse later when something breaks down in our society.
So Sarah, before we open the floor, I mean, you're talking of race being a systematic issue, one that shouldn't be on the incidents. But I mean, is one of those systems that's lacking is criminalization of racism? Do you think that's something that should be implemented? Do you think it could assist? Maybe if Drew can also comment on that after.
I've never been one who was hot on criminalizing anything that's based on home, domestic stuff that happens with people's minds. And I give the example of talking about the honeymoon. There was a public marriage that happened in 1994, where we had the elections and government of national unity. That's what I call public marriage. But the private stuff that needed to be dealt with was never dealt with. And as a result, you then have a young white guy in 2005 who went into an informal settlement in the Northwest and just started shooting people randomly. I remember that back then how we all had our hands up saying, what happened? This is a guy who was born just before democracy, who should actually be more knowledgeable about people living together and issues of prejudice. But it's because we didn't deal with the whole. So criminalizing that, I read an article a couple of weeks ago about how it's a sign of feeling defeated. Like we've tried everything, now let's criminalize it. And I'm still to see the results of that. Penny Sparrow came through, and there was I know this is not a popular name, so I can see that there's no nodding. But Penny Sparrow came through, and there was a fine. I wonder if you saw Penny Sparrow today, if she was still working, black people shouldn't be at the beach.
Thanks, Alam. Do you want to?
Yes, I just wanted to say, maybe it's about that time that we divorce ourselves from that public marriage. Reason being, the people who were at the fore at the so-called Convention for Democratic South Africa, it was a few ANC people, namely Mandela and Ramaphosa. And maybe that's the reason why people put such a heavy burden on Mandela, because people had so much expectations, even though certain dreams definitely would have been realized at a much later stage. But for instance, the working class in this country, the conditions of the working class have improved cosmetically. So the changes have not been really substantial for the workers. Thus we had the black government massacring its own workers, which is a situation whereby people never thought South Africa would reach such an extent, but we've actually passed that particular extent. And I agree with him partially when he says that, that when you say criminalization might be difficult, especially the implementation aspect. Thus I said when I started, these problems are of a political nature. Maybe we need a third CODESA to address the issues of workers, the issues of land, and issues of racism. Considering that also today the youth is very much militant and they're at the fore, it's about time maybe that we have a third CODESA to pave the way for a better tomorrow.
Racism, criminalization.
Coming from government, it's quite difficult for me to say whether I'm for or against, but one of the things that we've realized doing the consultations on the NAP is that we don't have anything else in place to deal with discrimination, with hate speech, with hate crimes. And I think what you said, Selo, is quite important, that we sort of admit that we've been defeated. And we got to a point where we're so desperate. And I would have thought, maybe 20 years ago, we would have had programs in place, activities in place that would assist us to change mindsets, to change what happens at home. And this is for me the big challenge. We do not have a set of ideas or programs there to address.
I mean, is it too late to rescue the situation now? I mean, I don't know. So we're doing very good on time, so we can have I say at least 2 rounds of hands. So can we open the floor for the first round? Yeah, there's 4. So can we just go 1, 2, 3, 4? Thanks. Come to the next round.
Hello, my name is Barbara Klugman. I'm with the Constitutionalism Fund. I wonder if the people on the panel would like to talk about the question of language. Because it seems to me that that's the biggest thing missing, is that we're in a society where, from what I can see, hardly any investment has gone into creating a society where everybody speaks each other's languages. And the lack of investment in quality teaching of African languages in particular is staggering to me. If any of you try to go and find a place where people can teach you, so I've been learning Zulu my whole adult life, and there's hardly anybody well trained in teaching the languages. And I'm just surprised that in a context of all this discussion about race, the question of culture and meaning and construction of meaning and the importance of language in that isn't on the national agenda.
Thank you. I'm Kimani Ndungu from Lawyers for Human Rights. I'm wondering if and whether the panel can comment on the intersection between racism and Afrophobia. And by Afrophobia, I mean xenophobia, which is probably we all know is essentially class warfare between South Africa's poor, who are primarily black, and black migrants, by and large from the African continent, but also from Asia. So please talk about that. And then secondly, if we talk, there has been a lot of talk about criminalizing racism. Should we also not criminalize xenophobia? Is that a way to go? So please, let's share your thoughts on that. Thank you.
is Alison. I wanted to ask a question about the National Action Plan specifically. My understanding of the sort of theory behind the action plan is that social cohesion is one of the main objects. But the question of how you create social cohesion, I would imagine that it is more a function of actual equality, structural equality, which is a function of dealing with structural inequality, which does not, in my view, I would submit, really, it's not dealt with by celebrating national days. I mean, that's just not, it's not. And the other question I'd like to ask is just in terms of what appear to be some of the conflicting legislative programs. You talk about the cyber bill, monitoring cyber racism. I happen to be working on that bill, and it does not in any way monitor cyber racism. And if you look at the question of foreign nationals in South Africa, we're looking at draft legislation that proposes that refugees no longer have the right to work. So just in terms of, what is the level of buy-in and coherence around this plan within the different departments?
Thanks. I think the last one was the gentleman from EE Law Center.
Alison had already asked part of the question, which was, I just wanted to find out what the role of the National Action Plan is necessarily, if it's not, yes, it is complying with the international obligations, but in terms of the real effect on South African society, what do you envision it to be? If it's not going to be legislation, and if it's not going to be policy, what effect should it, what role should it play? Because I envisioned it being the key instrument to go to in terms of directing government programs and other societal programs to address the scourge of racism and other prejudices like that. So I'd love to hear more clarity on what its role is and what its role should be.
Okay, can we just give the panel, I see it, can we just give the panel a chance to respond and then we'll come back to Elise, I think we'll pick up the last question and respond to those.
Let me start with Alison's question and comments on whether social cohesion is the main object and how to create this rather, and should it not rather be structural equality. I cannot really comment on the cybercrime bill and other legislation. What's quite important to notice is that when the NAP in 2009 came to the Department of Justice, we did not have that much political buy-in. This came along the way because the department only played a facilitation role. And as it went along, currently we do have partners where we report on the outcome-based approach of government. So the NAP is written into outcome 14, and we do have the partners of Home Affairs, Arts and Culture, etc. there. It is evident that we should admit that we do not always collaborate on issues, and that sometimes it's important to note the migration policy. The same question comes along to say, but did you work together on that? And no, we didn't, but currently the Department of Justice, our Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, have requested us to start working with arts and culture specifically. Now we have joined them during social cohesion programs, and we have realized that that might not be the only answer. And wherever we go, we also notice that people do not know where to take their issues, where to report issues of inequality. I want to jump also to the question that was asked last about the role of the NAP, and I think I might not answer your questions directly or not give you the answer that you might want. What we envisage with the NAP is that the NAP would become like an umbrella for policy and legislation to be aligned to it. It's also important that the NAP should be implemented on every ward level in the country. There's over 4,000 wards, so that's quite a big task. We are not nearly there. We don't even have, as I said, a program to say this is what we are taking, because we are still getting inputs and we are still hearing what society and our people in South Africa want. And to say this is what can work, because every community, even in the provinces when we went, you find that the contextualization of issues is different. And we want communities to come forward to say this is what we can do. Civil society who work there has given us quite a lot of input on this. So the NAP as envisaged for us currently is that it's not only government, it will be civil society, Chapter 9 organizations, and it comes down to every individual in this country to play a role, to play your own role and contribute.
Sir?
Thank you. Well, maybe to kick off with the point that you made about the divorce. You know what? One of the things that I've been very keen for us to maybe have a discussion on is how the divorce will look like. Because for me, when you divorce, it's about doing differently in a society like ours, and part of that doing differently is ensuring that you not only call out racism. You see it. So I'm always outraged by people who call out racism. It's just a quick social media thing, post, did my part. But it actually takes more than that. You have a pastor who says things that were outrightly just unacceptably racist. And you find civil society being the one that's the quietest because it's one of our own who does that. And Christians just go completely quiet because it's one of our own. It's when it's one of our own that divorce needs to then be instituted. Because for me, that pastor racist sermon, it's one of those that should have outraged the whole country, that we should have been marching the next day. But again, in true nature, it was a Sunday. By Wednesday, there was an apology. Sunday, he gave a black pastor to preach. The following week, he preached again. And it's all forgiven. Oh, fantastic. We all, well, and for me, it's about doing differently. And until such time that we find that language of doing differently, that's when we can then start talking. And then another thing that we need to also be aware of is that racism is not just a South African phenomenon. We tend to think, wow, we're unique. We're going through these things. And when Black Lives Matter was going on, that's a US thing. Meanwhile, police can just drag a black man behind a police van, but they will never touch a white man and do that. And such, until such time that we realize the interlink between these things, that it's actually not a uniquely US thing. It happens here on a daily basis. That cops feel free to just stop a guy who's dark in complexion. You must be from some African country. And all of us, most of us, we just go past. We don't even intervene to say, guy, what is this about? And that's what Kimani is talking about. That it starts with us starting to say they are black or white, and then once we fail on that level, then he must be from Kenya, he must be from some African. Once we fail from there, the person can lead in my local council because they were born in KZN. And then where's it gonna stop? That they were not born on my street, so they can't be a street council or whatever is there. So I think all these levels need to be acknowledged for what they are. So if we are starting to talk about criminalizing, we must then go further. I agree with you, Kimani, that it can't just be about black victims, white supremacists. It actually also goes back to hate crime in its totality. Then the issue of language, I agree with you. It's language and culture that today you can be told. We were told over, I was in school, primary school, over 30 years ago, and we were told on specific days you couldn't speak your mother tongue. You could only speak English. And when you spoke your mother tongue, you were being shamed for speaking your mother tongue. And 22 years after democracy, these kids, these learners are now saying the same thing. We're told we can't speak our African languages. Are you kidding me? In this day and age, and that's we then reduce it to hair. And we're not listening to these learners who are saying, actually, it's beyond hair. There's language in this thing, there's culture in it. We ignore all those things. No, my hair. And you look at Facebook posts, it's about my hair, my afro, I'm gonna wear it tomorrow. Come on. And if we are to deal with racism, we must deal with it in totality. Because these things are things that then erupt. We forget about the language thing. It will be an issue in a couple of weeks at a time when we'll be told again that some child can't speak the mother tongue. My daughter, just this last example, my daughter, reminding ourselves at home that my daughter had the same thing about braids on her hair. So I wrote to the school, this is about 4 or 5 years ago. I wrote to the school and said, no, you're not touching my daughter's hair. That's how she wants to wear it, that's how she's going to wear it. And the matter was then dealt with, and there was a meeting, and no, that's how her hair was going to be worn. But you sign a document that says, I will abide by these things, and then when they erupt, you don't at the point of thinking. I raised it at the point, I said, I'm not going to agree to my daughter suddenly having to have a cheese cone. But then we get, it takes one incident, and then suddenly it's a big deal. Last one, the xenophobia one I touched.
Yes, I just wanted to state that irrespective that certain institutions craft these nonsensical policies, it doesn't mean that if one person signs it and then the institution says that, but you signed it. If it's against the general law of the country, of the constitution, then it simply falls away. And I just wanted also to speak to you, madam. You spoke about the issue of it as Hambisana not hear me as Africans, issues of language. Just to highlight a particular school where black people love sending their kids, Kuro School. That particular school does not teach any African language, yet we know that by learning language, you learn certain aspects and certain elements of culture. I was actually impressed last year when the Fees Must Fall and the Rhodes Must Fall movement, they spoke strongly about decolonization. Decolonization touches on that, issues of language, issues of curriculum. For instance, at law school, when you learn certain aspects of the law, you're told, no, the Romans did this, the Greeks did this, the Dutch did this. And it's as if, as Africans, we never had systems of law to govern us. So we find that even the curriculum, for me, it was only at final year, actually at the third year, after 3 years at law school, that I was exposed to a black author, which was Steve Biko. Mostly you learn about Europeans, Americans, Australians, and we don't learn about our own people, our own struggles, our own literature. And to touch on what Comrade Kimani raised with regards to Afrophobia and xenophobia, I think also when it comes to that, it's my view that these are also very deeply entrenched political issues, because at the core, it's the struggle for resources. And you find that most people who come into the country from other African countries would basically, a good number of them would join the lower classes of society. So there's that struggle between people on accessing the resources. And with regards to the action plan, the problem with the ANC-led government is that it's usually a reactionary government. When certain situations arise in society, it's then that they want to now take the lead and say, these are the solutions which we're going to come with. For the past 20 or so something years, these problems have existed. They never came up just yesterday. but the current leadership has basically assimilated and they're quite comfortable. People like Ramaphosa, they're quite comfortable not dealing with these issues and taking the slice of the cake and yeah. And when it comes to nation building, as long as I think we don't address these particular issues, like I said, it's my belief that maybe we do need a third CODESA. That if the third fails, maybe a fourth, so that we do entrench nation building. Unfortunately for liberals, nation building is transformation, assimilation, and not going to the core of issues. And we cannot speak of nation building when the majority of the population are still economically disadvantaged. That would be nice. That's what
I think Umju doesn't believe in Asima Valo, but I think neither does the government. I think, yeah, I'm coming to the Zant, but I think it took many years before the University of KwaZulu-Natal Senate passed the language policy of making Zulu compulsory for all students at the university. There's a lot of pushback by people saying, well, we should learn French or Mandarin because these are international languages. At what cost do we then venture into the outside world? We can't speak to the neighbor sitting next to us in a taxi or when we walk on the streets. I'm going to do something really unconventional because Ntukozo has joined us. He couldn't make it this morning, therefore he's delayed. I'm going to ask him to just respond to one of the key questions and then I'll open the next round. But in Ntukozo, on the brief it says, how should we as a society deal with extreme or maybe even normal situations where comments like, we will give tip when you return land is made, when people donate over 100,000 rand to the victim of such an incident. And I know you said it that you're not the only one who made that comment, but maybe you want to talk about that comment before I open the next round. So if you can just engage us for a few minutes.
Thanks, Mikhail. Firstly, I'm very sorry that I couldn't make it. I hope that I'm well. On your issue about what then became to be known as Tipgate, what I want to emphasize is that I'm not interested in talking about the issue of Tipgate within a conversation that is about racism, because in this country we've got a phenomenon where it seems that we are not clear what racism is. So a lot of the time, responses from black people are batched within the same problematic actions that white supremacists that I'm sure you guys have discussed, like Matthew, whatever his name was, and Penny Sparrow, and so on and so forth. You find that people then tell you that you are racist for calling out racism. So I am then the racist person for saying that there is something fundamentally wrong about the ways in which racism in this country exists in patterns of land redistribution. So on the issue of tipping and the issue of whether or not those things are extreme, I do not think that it is extreme to express a position that the Constitution itself mandates us to actually pursue. Because land redistribution isn't a thing that we are manufacturing in the air. It is a constitutional imperative. So when we say that we want the land back, we are actually saying we want the Constitution to be implemented. And a lot of the time I'm frustrated, again, by this notion that wanting our land back from white people is equated with racism. That is just insane. Can we just get that out of the way? There is no such thing as black racism. Black people cannot be racist, not in a country that remains fundamentally white supremacist as this one, not in a country where we remain dispossessed, not in a country where, actually, we can't even wear our afros now, right? According to Pretoria Girls. So I think, following the conversation since coming in, I would have loved a conversation about land, because I think that's the core of the issue for most of us. For most of us who understand racism as a historical phenomenon which dates back to when the first settler arrived here in South Africa in 1652, as opposed to something that is somehow new, because, you know, I saw in the topic there was something about, you know, there's been an upsurge in cases of racism. Let's be clear, not for black people. Maybe for white people who've been living their best lives,
Yeah.
they are waking up to the notion that actually there's racism in this country. But from our experiences as black people, we have been experiencing racism. Not just for the past 22 years, but since 1652. And that racism is linked to that notion of dispossession. So we are not interested in having a conversation about racism that is divorced from how that process as an invention actually takes place. So if you read people who have written about racism in any authoritative way, I mean, you know, from people like, yeah, if you are looking at people who wrote about Orientalism, like Edward Said, if you're looking at people like Fanon, if you're looking at people like Biko, if you are looking at people like Mudimbe, who write about this notion of the invention of the black person as the inferior other. That invention isn't just because inventing race is nice. The invention of race is specifically for the purpose of going around the world dispossessing people of their resources and of their land. Okay? So when we talk about undoing racism, which is why for me, I'm very uncomfortable with this notion that we will undo racism by criminalizing it. So let's be clear. All white people are racist.
Yep.
That might seem like a very controversial statement, but it actually isn't when you look at it. It's just a matter of degree. Just like I believe that all men are sexist, I do believe that we are all outcomes of a sexist society. In fact, I think it is arrogant for a white person to assert that they are not racist. Where were you raised? In Mars? If you were raised in this racist society, then it means you do acknowledge that you do embody those aspects of that society that we detest about it. And that includes racism. Okay? So I'm not sure how, for me, when we're working around that definition of, you know, how we would, because that was one of the questions, how we would prosecute racism, how we would criminalize it. I do struggle with that because I'd have to lock up all white people tomorrow. Especially in a context where, again, as I said, really we're talking about a notion of dispossession. So white people, we do know they occupy, and let's be clear, it's an occupation. This is what settler colonialism was about. Settler colonialism was about arriving in a land from some other place, inventing the notion that people are inferior, and that you are therefore, by that inferiority, entitled to their resources, right? And taking them. We know all the legislation from Rhodes' Glengarry Act to the 1913 Native Land Act to the various apartheid legislation where forced removals took place. We know that the land is stolen. So why does it become so controversial then when we state that we want our land back? And that then gets batched with these so-called extreme cases of racism. I mean, excuse me, but wanting my land back isn't racism. It's like when women assert that they want reparations for like the hundreds and hundreds of years of patriarchy. Are you gonna tell me it's sexism against men? Where? When women in Europe are still fighting for equal pay. I mean, the leading cases before the European Union at the moment are women in 2016 asserting that they're entitled to the basic dignity of the same salary as the male. Right? So, while these intersecting oppressions, right, because we must talk about them in totality, we mustn't talk about racism divorced from the question of gender, from the question of sexuality, and other forms of oppression that exist. Because, for example, we haven't even touched the question of the black women in South Africa and black women's reality. What does that mean for them to be at the bottom of the bottomest of the ladder? Right? You've seen the statistics. Just a few weeks ago, a study was done that shows that they are paid, I mean, ridiculously many times lesser. And that's those that are in professions. So So when we're talking about these things, we're talking about systemic issues. We're not talking about unkind exchanges of words. I will not tip it till we get the land back. That's just words. Nobody cares. The reason why words in particular became problematic on this question of racism were those words like, if you use nigger or kafir, those words became problematic not because they were problematic in and of themselves, but they became problematic because they validated a notion of dispossession. This is what I understand it to be like. And I invite other people perhaps to participate in the discussion about how they understand racism to be. Because for me, I'm not interested. And this is the thing, like we've seen with the various student movements, right?
Chokozo, can I ask you
to wrap up,
yeah.
With the various student movements, we...
You are being silenced. You can see that Nikhil is spinning.
With the various student movements, well, so, I mean, you know, a lot of people, sure, yo, drop some bars. a lot of people have turned around and told us, as the people involved in the various student movements for decolonization in the various universities, that we, you know, calling us terms like racist and so on and so forth, because we problematize whiteness within university spaces. Now, all of that comes from a misunderstanding of what racism is. And I invite the panel, perhaps as we go forward and as the discussion happens, for people to think about what racism means as a historical phenomenon invented by a bunch of Europeans that went around the world mass murdering other people because they branded them as inferior, and therefore they were entitled to their resources, they were entitled to their lands, and so on and so forth. That's what we're talking about. In the same way that we do not divorce anti-Semitism from its very particular historical process, I do think we need to talk about how racism just becomes anything and everything. In fact, the reason why I'm nervous about the criminalization legislation is because in England, when they had the Race Relations Act and they criminalized racism, the first person to be prosecuted was a black person. I mean, what sort of insanity is that? So really, this whole thing is a systemic issue about power and about how power is distributed in society. And at the heart of that is the issue of settler colonization, which is still going on in this country and which has gone on since 1652 and which has continued under the ANC government with us not getting our land back. So until we get the land back, I'm not interested in a conversation about racism.
Thanks, Chokozo. And here first, I think there's this gentleman. We'll go back to the advocate sitting on. We'll come back.
Thank you very much. A bit worried to speak after the last speaker, who was, very militant about Van Riebeck the Thug and so on. But however, the topic about Mandela selling the country should also become part of a discussion of the Kodeza that you're proposing, so that we're in a position to understand why is it that when we are looking at racism, we also create another state within the state that we have called Buremach, and understand the purpose of Buremach. Why do we have Buremach in South Africa when we are saying we are looking at equality and so on? The comrades that spoke are correct in that you look at the economy of the country, it's still in the hands of the few. The land is in the hands of the few. When the blacks start moving into certain the few moves to migrant. And it is the blacks that keep saying, let us discuss racism, but the other hand is not coming forth in terms of saying, let us try to deal with the issues. I was covered a bit when we were discussing the issue of the Tshwane school, but you are correct in saying we must not discuss incidences. We must be proactive in dealing with issues as they are. But would private sector come forward as well to party and start addressing the issues that we're raising? I was a bit worried when the African National Congress lost PE somewhere, and Helen Zille came out and said the blacks has failed, white people are taking over. I think it's worrisome. But also if you look at maybe the planning aspect of development of the country is also a problem. Why is it that it becomes difficult for us that are living in the south of the country, of Johannesburg in fact, to see a white person there in the south with us, so that we start discussing integration? Why is it that the massive development, the big houses that we see are on the north, but the south remains poor and so on? So those are issues that maybe as part of recommendation from CODESA, it's going to take a long time for us to go to CODESA, unless we push it as fields must fall process around race. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Can I just ask the speakers to please introduce themselves and keep it short, because I see there's a lot of hands up at the moment. No, the lady first.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Amelia Rohani at the Johannesburg Bar. A lot of what I wanted to say has been stated by Mr. Krobe, but the first thing that I wanted to ask is about a register or the identification of the land is very important, so that it stops becoming a conceptual thing of returning land and becomes an actual practicable thing, so that those processes start getting worked on. The other thing that I wanted to ask is, when this whole issue with Kenny Sparrow happened, I did a little bit of a survey, and I found that a lot of white kids under the age of 30 actually had no idea that apartheid was a crime against humanity as stated by the United Nations. They don't get the level of how bad it was. A lot of people think it was just a separate but equal situation. And until they don't realize, or until they realize that it wasn't a separate but equal situation, they won't understand why the legacy of apartheid still affects every single element in South African society. So going back to the point on education, about what apartheid actually was, it doesn't help that there's just one apartheid museum in the whole of South Africa. Cape Town definitely needs one, you know. So for people to understand the extent of its ramifications, and echoing the point, if we have criminalization, I would hate racism to turn into a flippant thing that people now just turn around and say, oh, well, you're racist, I'm going to press criminal charges against you, and then things that actually are have the nub of racism in them get kind of diluted by virtue of the fact that everything just gets whitewashed, for lack of a better term.
Thanks. Surveyor and the gentleman in the front.
Thanks. I think, firstly, in response to Comrade Ndu and the last is that what we need, Comrade Ndu, is not another CODESA. Because unless you understand that it is precisely that CODESA which has facilitated a counter-revolution in a democratic form, which has left a property relation, and with it, the social foundations of racism which are inherent in a capitalist society such as ours. You have completely misunderstood the problem at all. And I think that is a problem as well, to say that it is still simply an issue in reality of settler colonialism. Of course, that is a foundation of the dispossession of the black people in this country and so on. But it was a development as well of a modern imperialist capital, particularly with the mining industry, that you have had an objective necessity of, as such, of a system founded on the slavery of the black working class to justify and to dehumanize majority of the black people in this country. And of course, that logic requires that racism be extended to every other black person and so on. That even those educated in the best schools, such as the people that founded the ANC in 1912, who are always emphasize that part of the problem that we're having 20 years down the line is the fact that these are people who themselves never really had a problem with apartheid as such, but the fact that they were excluded from the exploitation and oppression of the black working class. These, lest we not forget, are the very, black Victorian elite who at Mangaung were men, with tall cape, with, tailcoats, with walking sticks, with top hats and hand gloves, who only were frustrated over the fact that they were excluded, even though they shared in the same culture, and like I said, educated in the best university. So my issue is that unless we understand that, we'll never be able to grapple with this issue, because even with the land question as well, it is not really and simply the issue of transferring the land from white people to black people. And Zimbabwe is an example of that, where particularly after the land occupation, you have had actually most of the white farmers dispossessed of the land. But the reality is, racism continues in Zimbabwe, as we see in this country. For the working class, the land is not just about an agri-reforms and so on and so on. At a much deeper level, it's about the ownership of the whole of this country in actual fact. Not just the land in an agricultural but also residential sense, but the mines, the banks, the factories. The fact that they want to take the ownership of the wealth of this country. Because unless you resolve that, you'll have problems of poverty, of mass unemployment, of illiteracy and disease, which under capitalism with the colonial foundations in a slavery of the black working class, all of that means black poverty, black unemployment, black crime, all of which create a sense of inferiority on the part of the black people and reinforces a sense of false superiority on their white counterpart. And I think the irony of the very failures of the ANC to address that, it is actually that even where we're making progress with regard to, on the racial consciousness in the white community, that has also been rolled back. Because the bitterness and increasing racial incidences in the white community, on the other hand, reflect the brutal disappointment of the white working class in an increasing side of white poverty that you see on the streets. That today you see, more people, white beggars on the robots than it was in the past.
Can I check the gentleman here, and then Chabi will be the last speaker, and then the panel can round up.
Yes, yeah. My name is Tendai Biti from Zimbabwe. I'm a constitutional lawyer. I want to speak as a foreigner. I don't understand your issues. I don't know about them. So I've got the liberty of making mistakes. And if I offend anyone, I apologize. I want to start by looking at the question of land. I don't think that I come from a country which has, in inverted commas, taken over its land. And that has not been the solution. That has not been a solution to anything. Because the process of dispossessing white people of their lands in Zimbabwe was not a just process. It was a process done in order to respond to a certain challenge, namely the challenge of a nascent then opposition movement. The process of taking land has been elitist. ZANU-PF chiefs are multiple farm owners, starting with President Mugabe and his lovely wife. They are the biggest farm owners in our country. So if the ordinary average South African or the young intellectuals, the comrade we have just spoken, think that land reform is a panacea on its own, it is not. It is full of contradictions. Many Zimbabweans are surprised when President Mugabe comes to these places in Swaziland, and many people clap hands for him, because the Mugabe we know is a fascist dictatorship. Hence the current struggles that are taking place in our country right now as I speak with you. So that's one contradiction. The other contradiction which is there is that of race in South Africa. I once lived in South Africa in 2008, and I've got anecdotes that I can tell of the racial victimization of myself as an individual. I've traveled extensively in the world, I've worked in the United States of America, I've done this, I've done this. But ironically, this is fact. The one place that I feel that I'm a black person is here in South Africa. Here, I actually feel that I'm a person is known as a black person and not as just as a human being. So I think that there are real challenges there. But what are the solutions? I was in the plenary session when young people were talking in the morning, and then I'm in this session this afternoon. I feel that your society has got deep-rooted problems of alienation, of reification, which require proper structured solutions. I'm not sure that CODESAs are the solutions, but my suspicion is that if there is no sustainable solution, I think that your society is heading for an implosion. And so I appeal to the leadership of this country, to civil society, to find a solution, because some of us, even as foreigners, I was in this country in April 2008 when xenophobia broke out. And the majority of the victims then were actually Zimbabweans. So I moved with Morgan Tranquilite in the communities that were affected by xenophobia in 2008. And so I think that there are deep structural problems in your country that need to resolve. But I also don't think that I think that issues of capital and alienation are real. But I also think that if Zimbabwe, because I've heard Julius Malema speak a lot about this, if Zimbabwe is being used as a model for land reform, I think it's a very bad example and a very bad model.
Thanks. Njabi?
Thank you. So just a question perhaps, and to start off by saying that I was at a talk and I think it was Moeletsing who was saying that South Africa's peasantry, unlike many other African countries, doesn't have land, and that is a big problem because of things like subsistence farming, and that they cannot really reap the benefits of some of the resources that that land could possibly bring. And that says to us that we do need to take back the land. Yes, it's not a silver bullet to solve everything, but it is some sort of a starting point. My problem, however, is that as a constitutional lawyer as well, who believes that it's a constitutional imperative to bring back the land, I cannot see myself endorsing the same violence that was done a long time ago to do it again, because we have committed ourselves to nation building. And so how do we reconcile the two is a question that I have for the panelists. The second thing is that race is of course a social construct, and like many of the speakers have said, it is about power, it's about oppression and maintaining that power such that you entrench it in education and things like that so that people don't get out. And that's why even today we suffer from internalized racism, where we ourselves as black people continue to hate ourselves and hate each other. And that is a process that's not going to be solved through legislation or policy. That is something, that's a commitment that we now have to make, looking into what are the schools teaching, and how do we then make sure that we change some of those mindsets. And mind you, changing behavior is it's a long-term project, but that's a commitment that needs to happen as soon as possible. And then to SLSJ, who planned the panel, where are the black women? I mean, if we're going to be talking about racism, we have to talk about the double barrel effect that it has. Black experiences are far worse than that of a black man. And in fact, some of the violences that are happening to black women are committed by black men. And so if we want to have a true discussion, we have to talk about the intersectionality that we face, not only as women, but also the LGBTIQ community. And so when we have these panels, we expect more from public interest people because we know of these realities. And so I think it's something that we need to talk about a bit more.
Thanks, Chabi. So I'm a bit afraid of giving the mic back to Kwame because he couldn't talk for a while. But I think Kwame will give you a minute and a half, 2 minutes to respond to anything, and then the panel will close.
Yes, I definitely do think that the issue of intersectionality, as Ntabi has mentioned, is one that we must foreground in any talk about black liberation. And this is why I'm grateful for the student movements that have been talking about decolonization in our universities. This is exactly what they've been talking about. They've been talking about realizing that the issue isn't just about, there are so many contradictions in this country that come from our history. It's not just a matter of, well, there are white people and then there are black people. Of course, that's there. But coloniality is something much, much deeper. The coloniality of power relations also speaks to gender. It also speaks to relations around heteronormativity. It also speaks to disability, things that we don't talk about in this country. So I do think, yes, to intersectionality. On the question of Zim, I get very frustrated with the question of Zim because everyone always brings up the Zimbabwe question. Oh, Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe isn't the only country that went through settler colonization. Other people have taken their land back through other means, right? Expropriation without compensation is an actual thing. So let's not have this conversation within the non-existent binary where it's either a Zimbabwe or nothing. That's just not the reality on the ground. The reality is there are many options that we still haven't played with because we've been sleeping. 22 years, and how much of the land that the ANC promised to have transferred back to black people has been transferred? Not even 10%. So, these things aren't just, the conversation about land is happening in the air at the moment, right? It's not happening here on the ground. We need everyone to be engaging it. And I get frustrated whenever I talk about land and people are like, oh, so you are AFF now. Or you are BLF or whatever. That tax group called BLF. But why? Why isn't active citizenship, isn't participatory democracy a principle that we entrench in our constitution about engaging in these issues as an active citizenship? Whoever we are. I don't need to be a member. In fact, this is exactly the problem. The problem is that we've left these issues to politicians. This is why we haven't had progress for the past 22 years. Progress will begin with you. I know it sounds very Gandhiist of me. Yes, you too can, yes, you too, it starts with you. But at the end of the day, that is the reality of the situation. We are not going to get the land back if we leave it to particular corrupt tendencies within this country. And, so to wrap up, then Nikhil, I do want in the closing statements, maybe the panel to go back to the question of land, because I hadn't, maybe it had been discussed before I had come in. But I do think the Zimbabwe situation what it does point to is a land redistribution program that is not taking place within a decolonial framework. Decolonizing a country means decolonizing institutions. It actually means you've got to do things differently. You can't have, the whole thesis behind coloniality is having that elite. So when Mugabe then has this much of the farms and has this much money to go and make his skin, apparently he goes to China from now and then to make his skin nice and shiny. Yeah, to Singapore. He has that money because there was no dismantling of colonial institutions. So at a structural level, we must think about what alternative institutions we want. It's not just a matter of, yes, we will take back the land. I mean, that's going to happen. And I'm afraid if any white person still thinks we are not, that's, I mean, bye. So we will take back the land, but really, it must happen within a framework of decolonization, which speaks to the curriculum, which speaks to affirming ourselves as a people that for over centuries have been told that we are nothing. The psychological damages, we haven't even begun speaking about that. But the way that you capture those things is you need a proper decolonial framework to work with. So that then your institutions of education are doing the work. So that then your primary schools are doing the work. So that then your high schools are doing the work. Universities are doing the work. Thank you.
Thanks, Ntukozo. Just for the record, and Chavi's left, we did invite two black female speakers. One wasn't available and one bailed on us this morning. So, but in your last 2 minutes, before Alice kicks us out, your closing remarks.
Yes, another date which I find very tragic, if I have the date right, is 1492 when Saldanha, the captain who was sent by the Portuguese, docked at Saldanha Bay and defiled our land by putting a Christian cross on our land without any consent of that nation. That was also part of settling the land without consent. Now I want to deal with Dadesibe. Wake up. And I realize that the issue of CODESA, maybe it's like a kind of a hot potato kind of issue. But what I'm implying, I'm not saying that, because if you understand how the CODESA 1 and 2 came about, including the terms and conditions and whatnot, why can't we in this day and time, if we've got certain issues in society, come together, let's not call it CODESA whatever, and say, these are the issues we have in the country, this is the way we want to go forward. And also I touched on the issue of the militant youth, especially the students movement in the country. We have to be involved in such a process so that we can address the issues of decolonization which are being raised by students. And I wanted to speak to the issues of contradictions. The lady, she's left, should address it. She spoke of contradictions in the sense that we want to get the land constitutionally, and then the issues of violence on the other hand. Now, if we attempt to get our land, and those who settle our land illegally resist, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to beg the land for 100 years? Because at the end of the day, we are being put in a difficult situation. It's either we assimilate or we just let it be. So I'm asking you as the audience, if we attempt taking our land back and we're not successful, I personally think we have to resort to other means to get the land, because getting the land, it's a historic wrong which was done, like Kwabe mentioned. Like I also mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that the purpose of racism was for economic benefit for those who oppressed us. It was not a matter of saying, oh, we just hate these people. It was meant to grow their nations economically and maintain that particular dominance all over the world. It's been said actually that white people are the least livable people within the world, because everywhere in the world where white people have had contact with other people, there have been genocides, there have been loss of knowledge. So lastly, as Nikhil is, with regards to Mr. Beatty, with regards to what he said, the issue of land is a historic wrong. Even if we remove Zimbabwe out of the picture, the fact still remains that this land was stolen and it does not belong to white people. This is land which belongs to the indigenous black people of this country.
Thanks, Miguel. Talking about young people, tomorrow at lunch, SLSG will be having a conversation with young and youthful students with civil disobedience. So we hope to see you at that. Elise, your final words.
I was saddened by what the gentleman said, that it's only black people who raise their hand to discuss race, but it's true. And you know, white people cannot come to the party until they acknowledge the privilege that was bestowed on us by apartheid. And I want to make an assumption. I think 99.9% of white people have not done that. White people are not ready because of this. White people get offended when we talk about apartheid. I was in consultations during the last few months where white men specifically walked out and said, "You're a sellout." And for me, that it saddens me, because we were supposed to be the first people to say, "Come, let's talk." On the land issues, I don't want to say really anything except that white people don't understand the meaning of land to black people. They don't have an idea of what land means to the rest of the people in this country. I'm going to end here.
Thanks. On the land, I'm not sure whether Kwame thinks I qualify for land, but I'm also landless. Sila?
Thank you. Because of raising my hands, I'm also landless. So put me in that register. Well, I think in terms of land, maybe I should start there. There has to be political will for us to move this regard. And I must tell you, the level of political will has been so low that we came to 22 years later, still we're talking about, I think it's 12 or 13% of the land that has been given back. And every time they reach the deadlines, it's shifted again, it's moved by another 5 years. And until such time that we then make this a point of crisis, that this is something that needs to be done with. And I must tell you, there are signs of hope, because as Professor Maluleke, please quote me as I say it. Professor Maluleke said, putting it there on Twitter, that when we were told that Jesus will be landing, we were not told that he will come with us with the camera. And I think the landing is showing signs that we're moving somewhere. I don't know what the direction is, but I think it's hope. And then the question of statistics that were presented, again, I said this, Akil, that until such time that we are horrified by some of the facts, the stats that came out saying over 70% of boardrooms are still occupied by white males. And there's like horror of 30 seconds and we all move on. And that black women were bottom of the ladder in terms of how, in terms of salaries. We were there at the foundation, I think, and those stats are just something that we cannot rest. And there was a period when you actually had white women being the ones who were beneficiaries of the BEE and all those codes. I wonder if that's not better than having more and more white males, 70% now being the ones who are occupying them. So I think that intersectionality that we keep talking about, black women continue to suffer the greatest. and until such time that that is dealt with, we go in those. So the reversal, I'm not really trying to be quick, because I can see that you are about to go harass me. So then the last two things, the issue of self-hate. Guys, I must tell you, there's nothing as heavy as racism. And being black, it doesn't matter how whether you're CEO of an institution or not. Recently, we went to, we were in overseas, I think we landed just we were in Sweden. And my colleague and I, who's white, we go through immigration. And this is how, whenever I talk about racism, then I say, let's also think of it as something that's global. We not just, you don't experience it here, just at Tambo. So we learned there, and it was Ven and I who go through it. Some of the people here know him. So he was helped within like maybe a minute or two. He went through. And as he went through, he then pointed out that that's my boss. And it didn't matter. The lady went on and said, what are you actually doing here? You need to be here, sort of justify your existence. And it's something that you carry with you. That you, in South Africa, you even stop for a second and say, I wonder if this person, you always ask that question, you ask yourself that question, and that's the heaviness of racism. Is this person just uncouth or just plain pure racist? And so, until such time that even ourselves, the levels of self-hatred are dealt with, we're going nowhere as a nation. Question of nation building and violence on land. I wonder if there's no violence already. And I think it's about, I'm not advocating for violence to take back the land, but it's about saying, acknowledging that there's already violence. There is no integrity, there's nothing more dehumanizing than not having something that you know belongs to you. Kasetswana, we say, and those who are Tsonas here, you never, your voice will never burn for as long as you're screaming for something that belongs to you. So, and that's an important thing that we need to always just acknowledge. To end off, Ntokozo, I think you said it again, as we said it earlier on with Mdu, that until such time that we begin to do differently, we're going nowhere. And I think the young people at the Pretoria Girls High give us hope, but that hope need not end tomorrow when we think we've dealt with the hair issue. Like I said, it goes beyond hair. That it starts with those policies that we sign off, that we must interrogate those things right from the beginning. That it starts with the policies that need to be changed. Regulations that are cast as if they are law, the constitution of the land. Until such time that you interrogate those things and we change them, our languages will continue to suffer. And you will continue to then be told that you are inferior. And you continue to go to that church that says you are inferior, that you're not working hard enough to be living in a house that you live in, to even deserve the land that you know is yours. Thank you very much.
From language to schools to land and the idea of criminalization, I think we can all agree that it's a systematic problem that needs to be addressed. And we hear arguments that the effects of colonialism is still being felt today. One thing that's very important to pick up is transformation needs to be practically implemented, and it can't be, as Ntokozo said, up there. I'd like to thank our panelists, Lise, Selo, Ntokozo for coming all the way and being part of this panel. But I hope the conversation continues after this and when we meet in the lobby. Panashe says, I'm not black some days, woman other days, and transgender in leap years. She says I'm all of these things all of the time. And I think that's something to remember, that these things are not divorced from who we are, and they don't just happen when it hits the headlines. Biko also says that black consciousness is not a color of skin, but it's a mindset. Is that still relevant? Does it apply today? I don't know, I'll let you decide. Thanks for joining us.
How are you? Thanks for your help that other day. Yeah. Oh, thanks. How are you?
Before we begin the evening, Florencia from Lawyers for Human Rights is going to come and share some sad information with us.
Thank you, Alice. Good evening, everyone. As Alice said, my name is Florencia Belvedere, and I work with Lawyers for Human Rights. And I just wanted to make you aware of some sad news. Some of you might have known Godfrey Peary, who worked with the Right to Know campaign. He was the coordinator for Gauteng and also a member of the National Working Committee. And unfortunately, we were informed this morning that he passed away suddenly yesterday. So there's two things I'd like to do. One is Godfrey was from Zimbabwe, and so arrangements are being made to ensure that we can repatriate his body back to Zimbabwe. And therefore, if colleagues here would like to support the family and contribute towards these expenses, there are details on how to do this on the Right to Know Facebook page, and you can make a contribution if you can. It would be greatly appreciated, and I also thought that it might be in order if we. I just wanted to request a moment of silence to remember Godfrey and the work that he did in his capacity as coordinator for Gauteng for the Right to Know campaign. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. And thank you for those of you who have hung in. We started early this morning, and I told you that it wasn't the 100-yard dash, that it's a marathon, and I can see the marathon runners in front of me. Thanks for hanging in here. I want to say welcome to everyone. We are all honorable. We are all special people, so I won't point out anyone in particular. I want to respect all protocol and say welcome to all of our participants and our guests and our special guests from various locations around the world. We have a few visitors here from the US. And then I want to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening. Judge Yvonne Mahora has had and continues to have a varied, stellar, and impressive career. In brief, amongst other pursuits, she has been a civil servant, a public prosecutor, an academic, and one of 2 women who were appointed to the first Constitutional Court of South Africa in 1994, where she served for 15 years until her retirement in 2009. In her so-called retirement, Judge Mahora continues to contribute productively and constructively to the South African Democratic Project and the rule of law in other locations on the continent. In this regard, she currently sits as a judge on the Appeal Court of Lesotho and also as a judge on the Supreme Court of Namibia. In addition, Judge Mahora also gives her time to chair tribunals and to participate in investigations pertaining to, for instance, the capacity of the judiciary in Zimbabwe and whether certain conduct of the president of Lesotho's Court of Appeal was impeachable. As if this were not enough, the judge sits on a number of boards, including the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, the Constitutionalism Fund, the South African Reserve Bank, the Advisory Board of the Open Society Justice Initiative, and the South African Judicial Education Initiative, or Institute. Moreover, she is the recipient of numerous awards and accolades, including honorary degrees from the University of the North, the University of Cape Town, the University of Pretoria, and the University of Pennsylvania in the United States, amongst others. With all of this, I am thrilled and actually amazed that she can be here with us tonight, and she is. And I'm honored to call upon Judge Yvonne Mahora, who is indeed, in the words of Maya Angelou, a phenomenal woman, to deliver the keynote address at our 6th annual Public Interest Law Gathering. Her address is entitled, Civil Society, Its Role in an Increasingly Assertive South African Society. Thank you.
Good evening, friends, colleagues. I just recently lost my mom. She was 87 years old. And in African culture, you would be required to mourn a parent for something like 3 months. Now you can imagine what that means in today's hectic world. Within no time, I wanted to be up and about because I had work to do. And then my sister, who is the eldest sibling, didn't want to hear any of it, but I did it all the same. She didn't know. She's in Kimberley, I'm in Johannesburg. And the explanation apparently is that amongst others, you're not supposed to attend funerals. Because, and understandably so, you know, the soul is still raw. Still raw. And I think I live that, I feel that. We buried my mom in June, but every time I hear about somebody passing, I cry all over again. I don't know, I wouldn't know people from above, so, but especially when somebody's young, I can't handle death just now. So I'm really sorry that, is it Piri? Godfrey Piri has passed on. Yes. It's a tragedy. I assume he's a young person.
Yes.
And it's totally tragic for me to lose a young life, whatever the reason was. But I hope his family, condolences to the family, and I hope, and all of us, I guess, because if he was a member of Lawyers for Human Rights, we belong to the same family. And but be consoled. Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight. And as good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
As Alice indicated, the title of my topic, I have a cold, sorry. The title of my topic tonight is the role of civil society in an increasingly assertive democratic South Africa. And you will probably, you've guessed right. The topic was motivated by the current state of things, situations in the country, and to say the least, the restlessness of society, particularly shown during the local government elections campaign. But truth be told, the role of civil society in its broadest sense must be part of any state's development agenda. And that's my view. If well positioned between the state and the communities that they serve, civil society, I think, plays a celebratory role promoting and sustaining democracy. Importantly, civil society is also appreciated for the socio-economic and poverty alleviation role that it is capacitated to play. In the case of South Africa, the role of civil society in the advancement of socio-economic, socio-political transformation is well documented. In particular, its role in achieving the constitutional dispensation as a decisive break from our authoritarian and unjust past cannot be countenanced. That, in my view, is evidence that with similar commitment, civil society's role today can be equally prominent in sustaining the very constitutional democracy they fought for, but not without untold suffering. That too, however, will not be without huge challenges. In the context of South Africa's development or developing constitutional democracy, the challenges are huge. Amidst the existing and emerging challenges, which must be faced, in my view, with the necessary boldness, backtracking is not an option. Be as it may, I'll avoid to venture a definition of civil society for purposes of this address. Suffice to say that civil society, as Adam Habib recognizes, in reality do not operate in clearly defined boxes, but often straddle the lines. It is therefore acknowledged that civil society today is no longer as homogeneous as it used to be during the struggle for democracy. The current plurality of civil society and the varied relationships they have with the state indeed serve to consolidate democracy at all levels, in that the state cannot take society for granted, and it will always be placed in a position to fulfill its obligations to society, whether through collaboration, whether through engagement, or whether through litigation. Much has been written on the role of civil society during the struggle for our constitutional dispensation. And allow me, though, to take you through a shortcut down memory lane, if only to remind you of the critical involvement of the sector in the advancement of constitutional democracy, with the unwavering support, of course, of the international community, in particular the anti-apartheid movement. That level of commitment, though often misunderstood, is evident in civil society's current efforts in its role developing and sustaining constitutional democracy. Also important for our purposes is, in addition, the critical role played by civil society in the constitution-making process itself, including in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That role and its importance is well recognized. It was during this period that the enormity of the work and involvement of the sector, making the constitutional promise integral to people's daily reality, have come to the fore. In other words, the huge challenges of implementing a uniquely ambitious constitution and the continuous role for civil society therein should have been plain. However, soon after 1994, the challenges facing civil society today still emerged, even then in 1994. First, the basic role of the sector as service provider shifted to a newly elected democratic state which shared the same democratic ideals as the civil society from which many state representatives have been generally drawn, and there was no longer a state which stood in opposition to its society's needs. That was 1994. Implementation would therefore be the least of society's frustrations, and at that point, the true relevance of the role of civil society started to be questioned, not only by the democratic state, but also by long-standing international donors. In the result, without much ado, international donor funding went directly into the state's development programs, if you remember, most notably the then Reconstruction and Development Program. Civil society was just left with a most fragile funding base, and competition for the available funding among civil society groups, as we fully know, became a reality. In addition, civil society leadership, having been absorbed into the state sector, and logically so, required the development of a whole new cadre of civil society leadership. Furthermore, as Hember, Mofokeng, and Simpson observe, civil society faced the tricky challenge of managing the relationship and the antagonism of a democratic state which they themselves had contributed immensely in putting into place and in creating, and which they supported. Within no time, civil society had to shift into the mold of critical evaluator, which is intrinsic to the role of civil society generally, and logically for purposes of whatever tasks lay ahead. And needless to say, that task has not been easy. It has not been easy to engineer over the years, no matter how constructive, no matter how supportive civil society was to the state. Particularly when political opposition latches onto the criticisms, which is of course within their rights to do. And under these circumstances, state insecurity would heighten, and in some cases, civil society would tend to recede. They would recede with a view to give government a chance. This type of response inadvertently shrinks civil society's own space, and the unfortunate result would be that the state then misses the opportunity to maximize the skills, the commitment, and strategies of civil society when and where it might have mattered most. In that regard, the state would lose sight of the critical role civil society can play in the implementation of its own constitutional agenda. That constitutional project, which includes the state's development agenda, has not been without rampant corrupt practices, which, if approached with the involvement and critical eye and strategic approaches of civil society, might minimize corruption and increase the benefits for the communities served by the sector. And it is for that reason that the fight against corruption, whether in the public sector or in the private sector, falls squarely on the agenda of civil society. How it will approach that role, taking into account its many challenges, whether perceived or real, is important for the impact it will make in society. That, I'm afraid, requires well-orchestrated and well-engineered strategic thinking and plans of action, which must include the maximization of available funding in the field for optimum effect, a matter which I will address shortly. Now, analysts have demonstrated empirically how state and citizens can benefit with a strongly independent and effective civil society mediating between them. And indeed, how the state can derive greater benefit, or society can derive greater benefit from state development projects, and even from private sector opportunities, I must say, if the social capital of civil society is fully utilized by the state. And, by the way, even by the private sector. Articulating the interests and demands of communities is one key service performed by most civil society organizations, in particular with regard to the most vulnerable and the most marginalized. In circumstances where trust between state and communities has been broken or broken down, civil society can become the most neutral and accountable buffer. Further, because unlike state agencies, civil society organizations are often more flexible and less bureaucratic. They have more depth when that sector's capital is combined with the strength of state resources. Civil society has the capacity to tap effectively and more legitimately into society's own social capital. And this is the case where the civil society sector function is to articulate society's interests on the ground, defending their rights or providing services, although articulating society's interests is a common role played by most civil society organizations. However, whereas state attitudes tend to be more permissive towards civil society, where it plays a service-oriented role, where its role is, however, more of a monitoring and watchdog role or watchdog nature, it conjures up antagonism from state officials. That should not be the reason for civil society, in my view, as I said, to recede in their efforts and their enthusiasm, because in doing so, it only makes the most vulnerable communities the casualty. Having said that, recently, communities have become more vocal and assertive regarding what they perceive as the lack of long overdue state service delivery, confronting state authorities directly without the traditional intervention of relevant civil society organizations. These community responses had generally resulted from issues which had arisen during the past local government election campaigns. While the assertiveness of local communities was celebrated as pointing to a more maturing democracy, where election campaigns seemed to be based on relevant issues rather than the reverence of political parties and or political personalities. However, in view of the violence and destruction of property which accompanied community assertiveness, the primary question which arose at the time concerned the general absence of civil society, which would, in those circumstances, have played a crucially prominent interventionist role and would most probably have mitigated the aggression and the impact of the anger of our communities. The secondary question was whether communities themselves have rendered civil society somewhat, see why I don't like technology, somewhat irrelevant. Yeah, the question was whether, the secondary question was whether this response and actions by communities have rendered somewhat civil society irrelevant in the discourse of service delivery perceived to be long overdue. Responding to the primary question, most of the relevant civil society groups viewed the situation as belonging entirely in the political terrain, leaving it to political contestation and to the state to resolve. In the process, the rule of law was highly compromised, and more tragically, the threat to life and limb and the destruction of private property and much valued public infrastructure, which to this day remains incomprehensible. A recurring question of concern to many communities on the ground since the advent of our constitutional democracy is that in their daily reality, the Constitution has no real meaning as they continue to struggle mostly with regard to joblessness, access to basic shelter, clean running water, basic health care and education, despite the gains of constitutional democracy and the work of civil society since 1994. As Minister Pravin Gordhan contended in his address to the press club in Cape Town last week on the 25th of August 2016, South Africa, he said, is not short of money, but it lacks capacity and strategy for implementation. With the all-round capacity and position on the ground vis-à-vis the communities they serve, civil society is in a most strategic position to enhance the implementation of state programs, including those of independent organs of state. Besides, although communities themselves, notwithstanding their literacy status level, know and understand their own concerns better than anyone else, they do not often possess the necessary critical disposition and strategic capacity to engage in questions of their own interests with the state. Civil society is therefore in a most logical position to play a meaningful role in advancing the state's implementation programs and thereby play a critical role in making real the constitutional project. Indeed, it takes a high standard of democratic maturity for both civil society and the state to appreciate the utility of a collaborative relationship between them and to manage the respect for a fiercely independent civil society role with a concomitant duty to engage critically with the state as an implementing partner on behalf of vulnerable communities. When I went to the Netherlands for the first time in the late 80s, 1990, I visited a child rights organization and was hugely impressed with their child rights programs, including the litigation that they took up against the state in most of their programs. And when I made mention of the pride that their donors must have in their work, making contributions towards not only the well-being of children, but also the children's rights jurisprudence in the Netherlands. And I asked my host who their funders were. Was I totally taken aback when she mentioned that they get 100% funding from the state, including in their litigation programs. 100%. Using the state's money to litigate against the states for children's rights. And that was the common understanding. That was the common understanding between the state and them. But as I say, it takes another level of maturity to be in that position. The anxiety arising from talk about the shrinking space of civil society becomes real when we consider the diminishing funding base for civil society work as a result of the gradual withdrawal of funders of civil society programs. It becomes real. This has resulted in fierce competition for a slice of the cake among organizations, each in pursuit of its own objectives and programs. What is at stake is that many necessary individual programs run the risk of falling by the wayside if they cannot survive the stiff competition. That, however, need not be the case if more funders or donors would be more open to a system of multiple funding, where a donee may receive minimal funding from several donors supporting a singular program. In that way, a donor is able to spread the cake much wider. Furthermore, one donee may then collaborate with another in regard to a particular program, thus sharing available funding, which would easily serve a dual purpose and might be more efficient and more effective. We need to be mindful, of course, that when civil society operates nationally in the context of global funding, with the free movement of capital, it will be affected by the world's growing focus on the societal strife and instability created by the so-called war on terror, amongst others, with funders seemingly beginning to reprioritize their support. And that is where, with the right timing, the need to cultivate a local or national donor community becomes relevant. Central to that idea would be the notion that, in appropriate circumstances, big business, although generally valued for the creation of wealth, surely has an obligation towards at least its own workforce and/or the communities within which they operate. Most critical for civil society would be the need to continue to guard fiercely and jealously its independence and critical thought. Of course, who said it would be easy? By its nature, the private sector indeed generally lacks the openness sufficient to determine externally the actual role it can play in advancing the relevant civil society programs that would sustain democratic dispensation. As indicated earlier, the growing assertiveness of communities on the ground addressing their own concerns need pose no threat to the continued importance and relevance of civil society. It might require a shift, whether the shift is slight or not, in the appropriate direction regarding the services to the communities. Regarding service to the communities they serve, where more intensive consultation regarding community concerns may have to be undertaken. Better still, it may also become necessary to involve communities themselves and community leadership in the articulation of their own concerns and their own needs in line with their notions of nothing for us without us. Such an approach also augurs well for the development of leadership, which is anchored within the serviced communities, and for stronger linkages between civil society groups and the respective communities they serve. Furthermore, This bottom-up approach to community service, where the most vocal and more assertive voices within the communities are from the youth, which, for optimum community and efficiency, would require a matching transformational trajectory in the leadership and or management structure of civil society organizations, thus also contributing to similar transformation in the field as a whole. In the current circumstances, in conclusion, in which civil society operationally finds itself, the need for collaboration and formation of partnerships is critical. The end objective of civil society's role and function still remains service to society and or communities, and not competition within itself. In hindsight, of course, the decision of international donors in 1994 to shift their generosity away from civil society was a miscalculation. The need to make real the constitutional project had then just begun, and the need for the services of civil society remains critical. It is therefore important for international donors to continue to give consideration to the needs of civil society in the service of people on the ground. More importantly, though, the call is also to national donors and philanthropists to play a more meaningful role in making the Constitution a lived reality for all. It is important for socioeconomic stability, and it is important for the creation of a just and egalitarian society which is envisioned in our Constitution. Thank you for listening.
Entertain a few questions. Questions, not speeches. I know this crowd well. So, any questions? Or short comments? Yes. Yes. Please stand up. No, I'm sorry, sir. I was pointing to my friend in green.
Hi, Judge. Thanks for the talk. It was great. The vision you portrayed of civil society operating in conjunction with government to implement a collective agenda is a very radical one in some respects. And I wonder what your thoughts are with regards to a lot of the things that many of our colleagues here work on, which is really civil liberties. Because if you operate within the kind of framework we operate in South Africa, property rights are well taken care of because people are invested in. Political rights are well taken care of because politicians like their rights and people like to vote. But civil liberties, and particularly the protection of minority groups, women's groups, sex workers, and so on, these are not widely supported. These are not, I wonder where protection of those kinds of liberties fit into that framework that you've outlined in your talk.
I made much of the need for civil society not to lose sight of the central role that they will always play. And the approaches to their implementation programs need not fall by the wayside. It is only with regard to the implementation, particularly of socio-economic rights, which affect the most vulnerable communities, where, as I mentioned, even government realizes its weaknesses in implementation. There are times when you really feel that government seems out of its depth and you lament the strategic and critical thinking skills that civil society possesses, which in those circumstances would stand implementation programs, state implementation programs in good stead. As I say, we cannot perhaps at this stage, particularly with regard to the recent accusations of regime change and sinister agendas that civil society has been accused of by state officials. You cannot deny that it will not be an easy relationship to engineer. But civil society should never lose, as I say, its fierce independence and continue to take up programs, even through litigation, in defending the rights of people. But that is not the only approach to take with defending the rights of people. Defending rights includes the promotion of rights. And the promotion of rights are central to the implementation of the constitutional project. And to the extent that there can be collaboration, not only between the state and civil society, but also state organs and civil society. I have, as a judge, been asked so many times by the Gender Commission, by the Human Rights Commission, to participate in their programs, their research programs, their public intervention programs. And I know we have such a strong, capable, resourceful civil society sector. And the question that I always ask them, why don't you approach civil society to do the work for you? And that is what I mean when I say there's a need for civil society to play what I think is also their role, making real the promises in the Constitution. And the only way to do that is to enhance implementation. And trust me, civil society is geared towards that kind of plans and programs of action. You only need to try it. And I know sometimes, not sometimes, all the time, government is totally nonsensically antagonistic to the work that civil society is doing. And strictly, it is just shooting itself in the foot. 20 years down the line, see what happened during the local government, as I said, the local government elections, campaigns, with people really struggling to get to terms with what they perceive as a government they have been voting for the past 20 years. And they still lack those basic amenities that I mentioned. It is painful 20 years down the line to see the same kind of shelter issues that the Constitutional Court grappled with in broad bloom, still being an integral part of our reality. A shift needs to happen. A radical shift needs to happen. But as Pumzile the other day when we had a similar conversation with the women's function, observed, we need to be bold. We need to be bold and pursue the objectives of our existence as civil society, despite. And the very same constitution that we played a role to put in place, as I said, is the very same constitution we should give strength and power to civil society to play their role effectively, despite. And the boldness is evident. Last week, the television screens were splashed with bold action taken by civil society. And that should be the spirit. I believe that state officials know the true value of civil society's role. I believe that they know it. What I don't understand is why it is not utilized. Why is it not utilized? Why do we still have to be here more than 20 years down the line? We might have to drag officials screaming on the path of implementation.
Hi, Judge Mahuro. My name is Dugan Fraser. I'm from the Wraith Foundation. Thank you very much for your address, and I think it touched on some of the really pressing issues that we face. I'm wondering if you watched the extremely fabulous Kajol's interview for the Public Protector Post in very recently, and I think we all should give Kajol a round of applause.
I watched it until Bongani Majola was interviewed. So he had done with his interview.
So you slept late that next morning. And I'm wondering if you paid attention to the shade that was thrown at Kajol for her very impertinent lawsuit against a certain head of state, and then for her impertinence in receiving funding from foreign donors. And I'm wondering what your thoughts were around that, and in particular, I wanted you to link it to the issues you were raising at the end about the legitimacy of civil society in an emerging democracy, and whether you think there are things civil society itself can be doing, because we understand that the state's hostile attitude to civil society is something the state needs to address itself. But do you think there are things that we in civil society can be doing to make our legitimacy better known? Because I think there is a very strong narrative around that pushes back against our legitimacy.
I must say my response at the time was, between you and me, of much annoyance. And I thought it was a sad response. My view is that civil society should continue to not only ask for foreign funding, it should continue to use foreign funding for their objectives. And I'll tell you why I say so. I do not believe for a minute that civil society is engaged in this country, is engaged in sinister objectives. I do not believe. And maybe I will speak like a lawyer, I haven't seen the evidence yet. But I, for some reason, tend tend to regard those kind of rhetoric as what it is, rhetoric, political rhetoric. And I don't even believe that those people, fortunately it is not state officials, but unfortunately they have an impact on government. I don't even think they believe what they say, they believe themselves. I don't think so. The work that civil society does, the programs that civil society pursues, stand black and white for everybody to see. And as long as you know that you are not part of a sinister plot, my view is that be bold. Be bold, continue with your commitment, use your skills to advance the very implementation that government or the state has no capacity to pursue. Just do it. And as I say, the very Constitution is there to protect all of us. I was hoping that I will just provoke you to get onto a path of more strategic thinking, you know, come together as civil society, or even call a conversation with government officials and iron out whatever differences there might be, real or perceived. We are South Africans, we're all South Africans, and our Constitution says this country belongs to all of us who live in it. In my view, the objectives, constitutional objectives of government and those of civil society coincide. It is the capacity which is different, the capacity to achieve which is different. And if government has any seriousness around implementation in the next 20 years, God forbid, I hope it will not take 20 years. But in the next number of years, if government is serious about implementation, it will take civil society serious. I cannot provide solutions. I can only provoke thought. And that was what I intended to do with that address. Something needs to be done, something drastically needs to be done. I think we can learn from the courage, the tenacity, and the boldness of civil society during the struggle for democracy. And trust me, those compatriots who are in government, we're part of that community. They know, they understand what is at stake. Maybe because I'm not a politician, I don't know. I'm political but not a politician. And maybe I don't quite value the rhetoric of politics. But if I could lock you up in a room with government officials, and I will only unlock it when I hear chairs thrown around. But you know, I think we need a serious conversation. We need serious discourse on a more serious note. Because as I say, the casualty is the people of this country. as you said, property rights are taken care of, but only for us. And I don't think that is what the Constitution envisioned. I don't think that was the idea of the mothers and the fathers of the constitutional project. I don't think that was the idea. And here we are. And some people are going to sleep under card boxes and plastic sheets tonight. That's what we got out of this constitution in the past 20 years. We need to correct that. We must correct that. And as you say, radicalism is maybe what is called for. But if I were you, I would continue to call on the international community to provide us with funding. I would perhaps go a little further, and I will start a conversation with big business in this country. You will have to answer the questions, the real role of business in this country, what it is, what it ought to be. We'll have to call on big business to see itself as potential donor of development projects and development programs, and get them to become donors. In Setswana we say, we have an idiom which says, Moto utusa, oi tusa, which means others will only help you when they see that you are helped by your own. You start with your own first before you ask from somebody else. And big business needs to come to the party. I know there is medium-sized, some businesses which give for individual projects here and there, but they need to take their rightful place as real donors of the constitutional project. And only we, civil society, can get them around that thinking, because civil society is the sector which understands the plight of the most vulnerable. And I think you have the capacity to do that. You have the capacity to do that. You've got to start doing things that have never been done before. We've long ticked the boxes. The boxes are finished. We need to go outside of the box now. Seriously.
Thank you very much.
Introduce her as the incoming public protector.
Don't we wish.
Good evening. On behalf of the Public Interest Law Gathering Steering Committee and everybody who's present here this evening, I want to extend our heartfelt thank you to Justice Mokgoro for accepting our invitation to come and present at this year's PILG event, and for delivering such a phenomenal, thought-provoking and inspirational message to us this evening. Thank you, Justice Mokgoro.
Please join us.
Entities meant to protect